Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to class today. Thank you for joining me, whether you're watching live or you're watching the recording. I appreciate you watching. Thank you for joining me today. We got a brief one today. I don't think this one will take us too long. We're just talking about knowledge of versus knowledge how. Kind of subtitled this to be thinking about knowing today. And so I just want to talk a little bit about these concepts just so we can expand on them briefly. But you'll remember previously we talked about the discovery process, right? We talked about that in relation to surveying and doing the different forms of gathering information. We called that discovery, and that's basically where we get the information from our users about how they interact with websites or how they interact with websites like ours. And so what we do from here is, well, we have to come up with a way to basically parse this information and understand exactly what's going on with the information that we're being given. And one of the big challenges in all of that is sort of bridging this gap between knowledge of and knowledge how. And so really when we're thinking about this process and we're thinking about discovery and how all that goes, right? The knowledge that we pull back from discovery is often imperfect, right? It's very important for us to understand that as we're examining user behavior, the way that people think they interact with things and the way that they interact with things might be incongruous. They might not be the exact same thing that we have going on there. So when we're thinking about what the user does and the challenges that they face as they're using our websites, it's super important for us to kind of consider the total package. So when we're thinking about what we get back from discovery, that knowledge is typically incomplete. Right? There are typically gaps there. There are typically things that we don't know or things that were misreported on. So we have to make sort of assumptions from different aspects of things, which we don't really want to do. Right? And so that's where kind of all this comes in. Right? Because users in general, they figure out things through trial and error. Right? And that's how we get this knowledge of, right? This idea that, well, we know that things exist. We kind of know what they are. We've heard of them, right? Versus knowledge how, the ability to actually do things. And so without proper instruction, what will happen is users will typically just sort of fiddle around, right? They'll just try different things. And sometimes that's fine, right? Sometimes you're in an environment where, messing around and trying to figure things out is perfectly acceptable, is perfectly workable. Whereas, other times you're in an environment where if you try to mess with things on the fly, it's not going to work out very well. So we want to make sure that we're sort of understanding how this knowledge is created through trial and error, right? Like that's what happens. And so the role of trial and error in developing user knowledge is incredibly big, right? Like it's the way that basically it's the way we interact with the world, right? Like it's the way that we interact with the world ever since like we're very, very young, right? Like your parents can tell you, oh, the stove is hot, do not touch it. But with the way that we interact with the world and the way we interact with things, we don't really understand the stove is hot, I should not touch it, until we try to touch the stove and we realize that it is hot, until we have tried it and seen our errors, which is one of those high stakes situations, right? As opposed to our low stakes situations. If you touch a stove and you get burned, that's a high stakes consequence. That feedback that you get of a burned hand is a high stakes consequence. Whereas, if you're trying to find out where another page on a website is, you can click a link, and if you don't go there, where you can just hit the back button, and you'll be all right. And so this kind of presents us with that chasm, right? This kind of presents us with that gap of knowledge of versus knowledge how. And we see a standard user path of getting from knowledge of to knowledge how as this sort of cyclical process, right? This just sort of trial and error over and over and over and over and over again until you get to that point on the other side of the bridge. Or rather, the other side of the chasm. The bridge isn't there, right? The bridge is what we're trying to build. So in regard to all of that, it's really important that we kind of have a look at the different types of knowledge, right? Being knowledge of and knowledge how. And so the big difference here is that knowledge of is theoretical. Knowledge of is kind of what we believe to be the case, and then knowledge how is practical. So knowledge of being that we are understanding the properties and principles without a goal. We don't really have anything in mind. We're just sort of trying basic principles out. There's no real endpoint there that we're considering. Whereas knowledge of is understanding how to use something to achieve a goal. So it's theory, right? Knowledge of is theory. You know, you're working through properties, you're working through principles. You kind of have this baseline understanding of the knowledge in the world, that things sort of exist in a particular way. But knowledge how being the actual practical thing of this is what I do to do this thing. And so we could achieve it through trial and error, like we just talked about, right? Like that's the typical path when there's no one else involved to getting us from beginning to end is this trial and error path where we're just testing things out and trying things and doing things over and over and over again until we get that result, that goal that we want. And the other way that we can get into it is education, is by learning, is by somebody teaching us or learning it from a particular place. Right? So you can just keep trying things or someone can show you how to do it. Right? And this kind of gets to the basis of like the difference between education and training. Right? So education would improve your knowledge of. And then training would improve your knowledge how, right? Like education is properties and principles that may or may not be connected to a single task that you can apply to other things and you can apply for the long term. Training being specific skills that are geared toward a particular task. So when we're thinking about knowledge how, what we're really thinking about is, well, we can just try it and see if we can figure it out, which is less than ideal, or we can be trained to do it. And so what that does is that kind of bridges off the road on the user's web journey. Right, and so we have one branch that's kind of going down the trial and error side here. And with each trial, they gain a little more knowledge of, right? Because you try and you fail and you learn. Right, so with each try, when you don't succeed, you learn something new that you can use to adapt for the next try. And so we have users going down that path. Right, and that's less than ideal. Because with each incorrect action, they gain a little more knowledge of. They still don't know how. Right, they just know that what they did didn't work, instead of knowing what to do that would work. So we're going down that pathway that, a little more knowledge of, but still no knowledge how. But each time you try and you fail, right? Well, what happens when you try and you fail? Like you get frustrated. That's sort of the thing that we all do, right? Is we kind of get frustrated as we're trying to do something new and we try something over and over and over again. And maybe it's just not working out the way that we think it should work out. And, it kind of gets on our nerves a little bit. It frustrates us a little bit. And that doesn't have anything to do with you as an individual, right? That just is you gaining a little knowledge of while still not having knowledge how, right? One of the things that I talk about in other classes is the importance of kind of being comfortable with not knowing, right? And there is a bit of comfortability in not knowing that can help ease user frustration, right? Nobody knows how to do something perfectly straight out of the gate. And so as we approach new problems, we kind of should be comfortable with the new problems that we're approaching, that we're just not going to know how to do it right away. But in terms of using a website, in terms of how people would get on with actions and being able to do things on a website, I shouldn't really need to feel comfortable with knowing how not to do something. Right? Like, this isn't a skill that I'm trying to learn over time and build and grow like we would be doing while we're, learning how to program, for example. This is something that I need to do right away for a specific purpose. I need to be able to register for this conference, or I need to be able to sign up for this class, or do this whatever. Right? So it's not something that I really have the luxury of being able to learn. Right? And so this gets back into the idea of affordances and feedback. Affordances, signifiers, and feedback that we've been previously discussing. Right? And the idea of clarity in our affordances, signifiers, and feedback. What does it look like it does? What does it say it does? And does it show us when it's doing something? Right? Because, especially online, we're not necessarily going to be able to take all of the users and guide them through the journey ourselves. This is where we use our design thinking. This is where we use our design tools. And it's to kind of help bridge that gap, so our users aren't as frustrated. Because if there are clear instructions in how to do something, it's not direct training, it's indirect training. Right? So there's less trial and error and more training on how to do a task to meet a goal. Right? And so really that's what we're doing when we're bridging the gap. As we are reducing that gap. Right? So we're going to use signifiers, we're going to use affordances, we're going to use feedback. Those are going to be things that we're going to use to kind of supplement what we might do as training. Right? If you were working with somebody on a job, you might show them how to do something. Again, we don't have the luxury to be able to do that with every single person that visits our website. So it's critical, as to not frustrate our users, that we have these things in place, these signifiers, affordances, and feedback, that are training our users as they're walking through the site. It makes things intuitive. Right? So it's not simply trial and error. It's not simply clicking on a random button. I click on the button that tells me that it does this specific thing. Right? We can also leverage web patterns. Web design patterns. We talk about that as knowledge in the world. Right? When we talk about web design patterns. We'll talk a little bit more about web design patterns in a little bit more depth later on in the semester. This idea of web design patterns and the fact that one of the ways that we do things on our sites is that we look at the way that other sites do things, and we do things the same way. Right? There's no reason to reinvent the wheel when we are looking at certain web design patterns. Certain ways of interfacing with information, right? Because when other people are familiar with how to do things, then they don't have to learn as much, right? We're taking advantage and we're leveraging knowledge in the world by leveraging patterns, right? So For example, when you have a huge website that practically everybody uses, like say Amazon.com, what you end up with there is you end up with people learning and being comfortable with a particular environment. And so there are patterns, there are interactive behaviors that we could look at that Amazon.com, for example, does on their websites, how they treat their buttons, how they lay out their content, what they do with links, so on and so forth. And if we set up things very similarly on our sites, then it's intuitive based on web design patterns that our users, the people coming to our website, have a specific expectation as to how they should be interacting with these elements. So we just design it in a way that meets their expectations. So if we make the user actions clear and we make the goals clear, then what we're going to do is we're going to facilitate quicker learning. We're building that bridge to get from knowledge of to knowledge how. Right? And we're not going through this sort of iterative process where they're trying and failing, trying and failing, trying and failing, trying and failing for who knows how long. Because the more they try and the more they fail, the more frustrated they get and the more they have the opportunity to just go somewhere else. Right? The key points here is that, just to kind of wrap up, as we're thinking about these ideas of knowledge of and knowledge how, and the differences, one, the first big thing, to just kind of recap all of our big points here, is that the knowledge that we get from discovery, the surveys and the observations, it's imperfect. Right? Nothing's ever going to be 100% perfect. Nothing's ever going to meet 100% of our users. And so as we're approaching a problem, all we can do is the best that we can to ensure that the problem gets solved based on the data that we have. And so when users are approaching a site, they're coming in with a certain amount of knowledge of, a certain amount of learning that they've done to where they kind of know how things work. And that could be very high, right? If you're taking advantage of a lot of web design patterns, right? The knowledge of, they could have a lot of knowledge of that could be applied to very quickly get to knowledge how. But if they have very minimal knowledge of, if you have a brand new interface with brand new, with a brand new layout and button types that not a lot of other sites are really using, then they have to sort of figure it out. Right? And so then we have our options, we have our pathways that sort of diverge out. The pathway of the trial and error, which is just our user keeping on trying and trying and trying, gaining a little bit more knowledge, getting frustrated in the process until they finally are able to do the task that they want to do. Or we take the path of the designer that we should be taking, and we leverage our web design patterns, leverage our signifiers, leverage our affordances, leverage our feedback, so that we are guiding our users down a particular pathway. So it's indirect training that are guiding our users in a certain direction that is building this bridge, that is getting them across the gap between knowledge of and knowledge how, to where they know how to do the skill they need to do. Right, remember that when people come to a website, they typically have something they want to do, and they want to be able to do it relatively quickly. And in general, right, that gets us all back to this idea of user-centered design, which has kind of been at the core of what we talk about, of what we've been talking about, and what we will continue to talk about throughout the entire semester. The user is at the center. Right? So we consider what they know and how they are coming to our site with how we build things. And so this gap between knowledge of and knowledge how only further demonstrates the importance and the need for user-centered design, for person-centered design, in order to ensure that we have the individual in mind while we're building these actions. And I said we'd have a short one today, not a long one. Just dropping a little bit of theory on you today for knowledge of and knowledge how. So that's really all that I have for you for today. Prior to, back when we taught this course in the 14-week format, I would probably only do the color theory stuff, which we did last week. So I just thought I'd talk a little bit more about knowledge of versus knowledge how, which comes out of your Don Norman Design of Everyday Things book. It's where that's kind of discussed primarily for our purposes, just to reiterate those concepts there. So that's what I've got. We'll hold here for a moment for questions, just in case anybody has them. Sure thing. Sure thing, Ken. You can call. We'll go ahead and wrap up here, and then we'll take your call. So that's all that I have for everybody today. Thanks for watching. We'll see you next time.